All right, let's move on to the Seattle Seahawks. Of course, Pete Carroll out the door there, very much the end of an era in Seattle. Mike MacDonald, very highly rated first-time head coach coming in from Baltimore. And Brian, not a huge amount of movement going on in free agency. They need to hit on their draft picks this year. They've been up and down the last couple of seasons, had a couple of real standouts. And again, they've got some great pieces there, particularly in the wide receiver room. If you're looking at the offensive side of the ball, MacDonald obviously brought in because of what hasn't been happening on the other side of the ball, and that ultimately did for Pete Carroll, who was the defensive coach and famously had the Legion of Boom in their pomp when they were going to Super Bowls and winning that one that they got under his tenure. Geno Smith didn't have the same year last year as he had the year before, and I suppose again, as it always is with most teams, the question is do they have the guy that they need to go where they want to go?
I'd imagine things are going to be very, very different in Seattle, and I mean that from from the top down to the bottom, from the player, from the coaching staff. He was I think he's one of the latest head coaching acquisitions to come in. That's because of the nature of how well the Ravens were playing and obviously going late into the playoffs. But one interesting that struck me, look, we've seen this before. It's not a big thing, and I'm not going to be saying if the season goes off the rails, this is one of the reasons. He sent none of his coaching staff to the combine. He just took a different approach to it completely. No interviews in rooms, no 10 minutes with these guys in advance of the draft. We'll wait till we have the pro days and we'll bring them in and we'll assess them. Byron Murphy was a great selection. There was a lot of talk that he would end up being.
Not to sideline the discussion, Brian, but that is an interesting point because it adds to that kind of feeling, and I'm sure this is something that makes the NFL slightly nervous at times, that the combine is something of a devalued currency. We saw, even more players deciding not to work out this year, and the high profile ones like Caleb Williams, of course, famously, and some of the other top draft picks who really didn't see the point in it, and I can kind of see where they're coming from. You're going to go number one overall, or you're going top four overall, you're going to be the top wide receiver off the board, or the top edge rusher for sake of argument. The only thing you can do at the combine is damage your stock, or worse still, pick up an injury and put yourself in a difficult position. So, when you have coaches now deciding to opt out as well, that's intriguing in terms of how that whole showcase continues to have relevance in the years to come.
Absolutely, but I believe it was a very different approach to how Pete Carroll was so heavily invested in going to the combine and having everyone there front and center, analysing everything, every piece of content and live action they get. So this is a very different year, and it struck me going, okay, we're going to see a very different Seahawks now. Whether we're going to see a different team on the field, I think you touched on it there. I think for years, and they did their utmost even last year in terms of free agency, trying to bring in defensive players. And then obviously they make the trade for Leonard Williams, giving away a second round pick mid-season. They're going to really try to get this defense back to the defense of old, which is the Legion of Boom. And I suppose they need to I think they're trying to transition away from that period and ultimately recreate a defense that can put them in a position to be, championship ready and go make a real push for the playoffs. I mean, 2 years ago, it was the element of surprise as well when Geno Smith had the standout year after Russell Wilson moved on. I think that was the best thing over the course of the last few years. Russell Wilson moving on, a fresh start. Maybe this ultimately will be the same, but sometimes we experience in NFL and longevity and all the various different sports, when you've got a head coach that essentially is controlling the wheels for so long and everything that goes on, ultimately, was as a GM there, he's heavily involved in decisions. It takes some time to kind of transition to a new period. It'd be interesting to see if that's the case come September. This team can hit the ground running. Geno Smith's obviously going to have a very Daniel Jones-like season in the sense of again, I think Geno's back to kind of prove it here, and if it doesn't materialize this year, they'll move on from him. But I think the pressure is going to be on for this team to get going again. It's going to be interesting to see how he plays it. And again, very different Seahawks to what we're used to seeing.
Kieran, if you're looking at the Seahawks from last year, and I was actually just quickly checking the schedule there to remind myself and how they went. One stage they'd won kind of 4 or 5 games out of 6, and they were sitting pretty. And people thought, yeah, they're actually going to challenge for the NFC West. Never mind the playoffs, that they may actually win the division, because their little sweet spot actually coincided with when the 49ers had a bit of a wobble. And then they lost 4 games in a row and never got it back again. They probably were a team that disappointed a lot of people last season.
Yeah, and I have Seattle as one of my kind of down year picks. I don't have a lot of faith in the Seahawks this year. There's a lot of factors at play between Carroll even. I think there's going to be a big Pete Carroll hangover. Somebody who was there for so long, who built it up. Basically, you can talk everything from Legion of Boom, throw in the Russell Wilson stuff. I just think there's going to be a massive hangover from his departure. Brand new head coach coming in, former DC with Baltimore. They'll phrase it as kind of a rebuild. They'll want to avoid the word rebuild. It is a rebuild in all to all intents and purposes. I don't have Geno having a good year at all this year. I think this is going to be his last hurrah as a starter. A lot of question marks on the offensive line. This is a line that's ranked anywhere between 25th and 30th in the league. No real standout players out there. And of course, we saw in the draft, everyone's scrambling for guards and tackles. And the Seahawks really don't have a lot of weapons or a lot of strength in that line. Defense is fine. I mean, they've got some great players in there. Leonard Williams is still there. Rayshon Jenkins, who they got from Jacksonville, and they still have Julian Love. I'm not worried about the defense. And they do have.
There's a sense there as well, Kieran, that like you saw Tariq Woolen, who wasn't quite the same guy last year as he was the year before. There's a sense there that the whole is not quite the sum of the parts, and that certainly was the narrative that was circulating around Pete Carroll's departure. That there was a level of irritation in Seattle, and a level of irritation in the front office that they felt the coach should be getting more out of what they actually had. So, and it's interesting what you say, because there's this sense that maybe the one Geno year was an outlier, and that's not the real Geno after all.
Yeah.
Whereas the defense might actually be a bit of a sleeping giant.
Well, the defense, I mean, that'll get you so far, but if that O-line is not, if it's folding, and it's not keeping Geno upright or even helping him in any way, I just don't have a good vibe about the Seahawks this year. We all know where they are geographically and the amount of travel that they have to do. They have a lot of East Coast games this year. Thankfully, the Dolphins come to them rather than them having to go to South Beach. But still, they're traveling, I think, 26,000 miles over the course of the season. And that is a factor. And then you throw in the 1 p.m. Eastern games, which is essentially 10 a.m. That takes some time to acclimate to. It's a tough schedule. The NFC West has got the AFC East and the NFC North in there. And with the Packers, resurging, who knows with the Bears could be a juggernaut. The Jets
may put that out into the universe. Don't be jinxing them already.
Who knows? We'll get to that in due course. But even the Jets might be competitive. So it's a hard schedule. It's a really hard schedule, and that's not even factoring in all the travel they got to do. I think that the Carroll factor, it's almost like they're going to have a couple of lost years up there in Seattle. They have a great soccer team. The Mariners aren't doing so good, so the Seahawks are really going to have to show out in the fall.
How did the Kraken do in the NHL this year? I didn't really see much Kraken going on.
Wasn't much crack for the Kraken last season. And the other thing as well, they were pretty quiet in free agency. They did make a lot of splashes. It's almost like what we have, we hold. We're going to hold it out, see if we can get a top 10 draft pick. We'll stay relatively competitive. We're not going to embarrass ourselves, but we're probably going to be good enough / bad enough to get a top 10 pick. And let's stuff it with some tackles and let's kind of rebuild. And it's going to be this will be Geno's last hurrah. I don't think he'll be playing there next year, or at least he won't be the starter. That O-line we've seen with so many teams. If your O-line is paper thin, you just shut it down. The Giants last year, from game one, when that O-line just folded, you saw what happened with the rest of the season. I don't think it's going to be a great season up there in the Emerald City.
If there is a reason to hope, though, Shane, as Kieran leaves it on a slightly negative note there in the rainy Northwest, Mike MacDonald is a very, very highly touted coaching candidate. And if there is a Shane Steichen or a D'Amico Ryans of this year, a lot of people are looking in his direction as maybe the guy most likely to outperform or to get his team in a position that they might not otherwise be in. You think of the way the Ravens season finished, and he was the one guy who really emerged with a huge amount of credit from the Kansas City game, which otherwise was a flop. They certainly weren't let down by their defense on the day.
Yeah, and look, I think he has as a Mike MacDonald has a great potential to be a fantastic head coach next year. I just don't see it happening in immediate this year. And there's a few signposts to that. Firstly, they haven't splashed out or are not panicking yet on the quarterback position. And I think it's because they know that Geno Smith, this is a bit of a prove year for him. They brought in, I think, Sam Darnold as a potential backup.
His whole freaking career has been a prove it year.
Yeah.
He did it 1 year. Give him a break.
Yeah, well, prove it again, pal. It's just like
It's
I
never
don't
enough
really
for you
know.
guys, is it? It's not enough for him to actually prove it. Now he has to prove it again.
I don't really know what to expect them. And when we were talking about earlier about the fact that the coaches don't want to fly down to Combine, is maybe because they're in the Pacific Northwest and they don't want to hop onto a Boeing plane which has doors falling off. Boeing, which planes who seem to be as unreliable as Geno Smith has been a quarterback last season. We watch some of the games they play. Like against the Rams, Geno was fantastic in making plays that went maybe 7 yards. Against the 49ers, so it was Drew Lock that played against the 49ers in San Francisco. But even a couple of other games that Geno Smith played, like you just felt that the offensive design, they were being very creative in a way that was trying to make use of the fact that the quarterback probably couldn't do step, look, put it down the field. The basic thing that you expect from an NFL caliber quarterback. And that's a big question mark in terms of the defense and the fact that, as Kieran alluded to, that they're not spending too much money in the off season. I think the Seahawks understand, a bit like what's happening in a couple of other teams around the league who are in a rebuild or a semi-rebuild, that there's no point in spending the money now. When you don't fully know what you have, you're coming in with a new head coach, you're coming in with some new players that need to fit in. What's the point in spending money if you're going to end up spending in the wrong place? And they even might be keeping a little bit in the pile if the Dak Prescott shadow starts coming over to the Pacific Northwest, which I'm sure will come up in just about every divisional conversation that we are going to have, the way that shadow moves around. But, it is going to be a conversation that's had. A quarterback controversy could even come up if they decide Geno Smith needs to be pulled out for a backup if he doesn't play so well. So, look, I changed my mind on the Seahawks a couple of times looking into this because I rate Mike MacDonald so highly. But at the end of the day, this is becoming more and more of an offensive league in a division where the Cardinals, Rams, and 49ers all have their strong points on offense. So it's going to be difficult to try and keep up with that. And what makes it even worse is the fact that we talked about Pete Carroll gone. He's not gone. He's still in the building. He's still lurking around like Alex Ferguson at Old Trafford, reminding everybody that he used to be the head coach. I used to be in charge here. And you can guarantee he's gonna pull Mike MacDonald to the side. They're gonna talk, hey, my Legion of Boom didn't do that. And even whether he says that or not, that's going to start playing in minds. And I think it's unusual that he's being kept in the building. And I don't think that's helpful as well. So, look, I think the Seahawks have great potential next year and the year after when the Rams are maybe a bit more beatable, when the 49ers a bit more beatable. Because we know one of the big things with the Seahawks is against division rivals, they've not been good enough. Against the division, they were 2-4 last year, and that 2 was against the Cardinals, who lost all the divisional games. And I think the Cardinals are gonna come in and beat them this year. So, I don't want to be too harsh on the team, which I have generally liked over the years. The team which I thought really had the potential to make the playoffs last season, but I think in the first half of this year, I think Mike MacDonald is going to find things a little bit tougher than he imagined.
And there's one thing, and it's a good reference, Shane. I take your point. One thing that we've loved in this division, particularly over the last decade or so, is that the rivalry between the Niners and the Seahawks had been arguably the best in the league. It's not at that level now. It's not the marquee matchup it was, because unfortunately it's Seattle that have become less competitive. They could always be counted on to turn the 49ers over at least once a season, and that was a real, they hated each other as well. But if they don't rate you, they don't hate you, to flip that old cliche on the head. And that certainly seems to be the way the Niners see the Seahawks at the moment. I would very much like the Seahawks to be a bit more competitive next year, if you like, because that was a rivalry I certainly really looked forward to. All right, we will wrap.
A quick one. Sorry, final point. The opening games for them, they play the Broncos at home, rookie quarterback, then they go on the road to the Patriots, which in all likelihood will be a rookie quarterback. So, I mean, the head coach, he's a rookie head coach, but ultimately after 2 games, he could be either 0-2. He really should be trying to make, they're in a position where they're good enough to be 2-0 against those 2 teams. If they find themselves not beating those teams, they then come up against the Lions and the Dolphins. I'm not sure in that particular order, but there is a scenario here where things can unravel very quickly and you can find yourself 0-4, and then the pressure really starts to mount.